Cool. So we're going to dive into this. So like a big part of our like podcasting journey has been, again, related to Emily's story. You're a year and a half out of Mizzou, like you're just graduated college.
Yeah.
So like before we kind of dive into questions, like, I mean, everyone here is either in their 20s or been in their 20s before, right? So it's like we all can be like, hey, I remember that, right? It's a little harder. Yeah. Alma, sorry. So like we were talking a little bit beforehand, like the idea of that age space in deconstruction is, I think, interesting to think about, right? Because I don't know if you guys have had this experience before, but like I think about my twin brother, like I didn't blow up a lot of things, but I began to question a lot of things around like church and organizational stuff. I started to be like, I'm not sure if I dig on this. Like I started to deconstruct some of that stuff. You had your sort of stuff as well. And you can share, I mean, I don't know how many people know your story, so you can share a little bit about like what got you there. But like when you think about your experience as it relates to deconstruction in your 20s through college, all that kind of stuff, like what was that like, and what do you see the connection like in that?
Yeah, so I was reflecting on my college experience as if it was like so long ago. It was like I literally just graduated. I guess technically it hasn't even been a year. I graduated in May. So yeah. But I was reflecting on my college experience, especially how it relates to deconstruction, because I feel like I lived both college lives. Like I lived the hyper religious, this is all I care about, this is all I do, read my Bible in public so that someone will ask me about the Lord. Like, like my freshman and sophomore year and junior year. Junior year was like COVID, so it's kind of interesting, but.
I don't want to stop you. Well, I do want to stop you a little bit, but I think it'd be helpful for people to understand the full context of who you were, to tell them about your Excel sheet, about theological terms that you're working through with your friends with the color-coded document, just so people know like where you fell on the religious spectrum.
Yeah, so my very first week of college, I was like, I know what campus ministry I'm joining because they align with me theologically. Like, this is who I am. This is what I believe. And my friends and I had Theology Thursdays. Where, yeah, I know. I get it. But we would just we had a Google Doc and we would write different ideas and thoughts we would have about theology. And then we would talk about them and highlight them different colors. So green was like, okay, now I feel like I understand. Yellow was like, not quite sure, still wrestling. Pink was like, oh my gosh, what the heck? I'm very confused. We need outside help. Purple was like, I think we know as much as we will know on this side of eternity. So that was like how I spent my college days. Like I was, super into it. It's like all I cared about. I remember being in class and pulling out my Bible. I didn't just whip it out. Like it was under it was something I needed to get my computer or something. I don't know. And my Bible was on top of my backpack. And this girl behind me goes, wow, looks like you really like that book. And I was like, yeah, it's my Bible. And she did not speak to me the rest of the semester. Which is its own different conversation about how people view Christianity and how it's been weaponized against people, all that. But I definitely, for most of college, lived the hyper religious life. I went to Mizzou, University of Missouri. I don't know how much you know about that. It's definitely a party school. And so when I told people I was going to Mizzou, everyone was like, oh, homegirl is just completely throwing away her faith and caring about living that out. And I was like, no, I'm totally still a super Christian. I was a religious golden girl, golden child, was still that in college. However, college was also a time where it was the first time that I had ever heard different perspectives. And that sounds extreme, but I went to Christian schooling all throughout elementary and high school. So it really was to go to Mizzou. And my first semester, I had a religious studies class where it just broadened my mind. And obviously at the time I was this is spiritual warfare, to hear different thoughts. But in reality, it was really helpful, and I'm thankful like to hear other perspectives. But then I would also say that I went to like the complete other extreme my senior year. Yeah, we're just gonna be real. I stopped going to church, was just really angry at God and angry at the church, and just like honestly just like dove into the party scene. I became a comedian, and so that kind of helps you get into the party scene. But I would like, my friend and I would go out on Saturday nights, like get super drunk, and I would just yell in the bar, "This is so much more fun than church." Like I was processing and going through some stuff. But
You sound like you handled it really well. So.
yeah, really, really helpfully. My friend was like, "Can you just stop saying that?" She was like, "Clearly you're still thinking about church a lot." And I was like, "Yeah, I don't want to talk about it right now." But I've just been thinking about that, and that I feel like I lived both extremes.
Sure.
And so I know there's like such a safety of being super religious in college and just being like, this is who I am. I'm not engaging with anything else because yeah, it's like safer, but you also like you never get out of your shell. You can totally stay in your shell even in college. But then on the other extreme, you can feel super lost.
Yeah. So one thing I think is interesting is like we often talk about like high school Emily, college Emily, and like now Emily, right? And so one thing, and I think we've talked about this before in our conversation on the podcast, but like you obviously like you haven't reached the purple side of your Excel sheet where you can know everything you can on this side of eternity, right? But you've grown and evolved and thought and all that kind of stuff. And so like this isn't like a shaming or prescriptive thing, but when you look back at what you know now about your deconstruction journey, and even before you knew you were doing that, like what would you like to tell yourself now? Like what would Emily now have told Emily in college and high school, like to look back in that?
That's a good question because I'm not sure I would have changed anything. Like I will say a lot of the hurt that I experienced from religious spaces was from my campus ministry. And that's not from everyone's experience, but like that was very hard.
Sure.
And it is sometimes sad to think about that. What would I tell myself? I mean, I would tell high school Emily, like, you're making the right choice. I almost went to the college of my denomination. I was raised Presbyterian, and I was going to go to a Presbyterian college, and I was like, yeah, Presbyterian or die. Like, but I toured that college, and I remember saying, I was like, I don't want to be in a place for 4 years with a bunch of people I agree with. Like, there's something so special and beautiful about hearing other perspectives. And so what I would say to high school Emily making that decision, like, hell yeah, girl, like good idea. I think college Emily, I think I would tell her, like, find the space that is safe to you. And if that is the religious space, then great. But don't I just shut everything out right away. Like I was like, this is the truth. And anything else that I'm hearing is like spiritual warfare or just the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And it just I just wish that I would have entered into college with a much more open mind and willing to hear other perspectives. Yeah, just actually listen and not be like, this is the truth, but I'll listen to you. Listen with the willingness to have your mind changed. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I also think what I find to be really intriguing is for someone that grew up not allowed to ask a lot of questions, you ask some of the most informed and smart questions. And I actually think I don't know if you guys grew up in religious spaces where questions were allowed to be asked. I know I did not. I didn't grow up United Methodist, which is my group now, but I didn't grow up in a space where questions were seen as beneficial to the Christian experience. And so for someone like you for myself, I think it took me a long time to learn how to ask good questions because I wasn't taught how to do that in my religious experience. But it seems like for you figure that out really well. And so I think when I think about the idea of deconstruction, some people really point to you got to get it done with, or you got to get it you got to push through. We talked about this earlier on. Deconstruction is really just a means to eventual reconstruction. And I think that could be true. I think my greatest hope for anyone that has demolished or deconstructed or removed, like, I want you to, I find value in Jesus, right? So I'm a part of this thing because I find him to be really valuable. But I think what I have found to be really cool about your journey, and I don't know if anyone else would connect with this in their own journey, like, I think the ability to ask really honest questions is perhaps the most life-giving part of it, because when we, episode number 1 to 40, the things, our conversation was hilariously different. Like, Emily said what she thought I wanted her to say. She asked questions that weren't really questions. They were just like, hey, Danny, can you tell me? Essentially, like, the first 10 episodes were like really great about patting my ego as a pastor, as like the smartest person in the room. She's like, man, you're crushing it, Danny. And now you're like, well, I think that's BS, or like, I don't like that. And I was like, I think that's what faith at its best can be, is push. And I think that's what Jesus did. I think the disciples push back, and like, I think you're pretty sweet, but I wouldn't put you on par with Jesus. But I do think, like, you're asking questions in that vein. I think that's an important part of the faith journey. Like, whether you put it in deconstruction camp or not, but I think it's helping your deconstruction, even though it feels sometimes like you're in the middle of it and you can't see where you came from or where you're going. But I do think asking questions has only propelled you to healthier levels, even if it feels like you're kind of in the midst of it.
I mean, I completely agree. Like, I think questions are so important. I'm a teacher now, and I remember being in class, and my least favorite thing ever is when I would raise my hand and a teacher would be like, not right now, like, put your hand down. I would be like, I thought that was your job. Like, I never do that to my students. I'm like, I will answer your question in the moment. And so questions always mattered to me, but I didn't always feel allowed in the church space. But that's why I think, like, our theology of questions is so important. I read this book on, like, a theology of questions, and it's called The End of Our Exploring. It's beautiful. And he talks about, like, the first question in the Bible is actually from Satan. Like, he says, did God really say to not eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil? So, like, the beginning of questioning kind of messes with our head and messes with what did God actually say? But then the next question is God redeeming questions. And he comes in after Adam and Eve have eaten the fruit, and he says, where are you? He totally knows where they are. But God redeems questions in that moment as, like, questions as a way of pursuing someone relationally. And I think that is, like, what you've said, like, how you said that deconstruction is a means of discipleship, like, at its best, and what God and Jesus, like, we don't have to get in. I mean, Trinity, whatever. But
let's do it.
But, like, what we see God doing, what we also see Jesus doing, is, like, asking questions to pursue people and to pursue relationship. Like, Jesus asked the woman at the well, like, I mean, I guess he just tells her about her life. It doesn't matter. But, like, that's what, like, I think our theology of questions matter is not something that brings us away from God, but is something that helps us pursue him.
Yeah, I would wholeheartely agree with that. And so, in the world's slickest segue, I think this is a good time to take questions.
I didn't even realize that.
I've been doing this a while. So, like, for anyone, like, out there, you could start anywhere, but, like, does anyone have, like, I mean, it could be a question, a theological question, deconstruction question for Emily or myself or anyone, but, like, does anyone have any, like, questions just to start? Yeah, please. Take the mic too, just so we can have it.
Okay, so I've heard before, like, the stories of, like, the Old Testament are, like, could possibly not be true, and, like, the story of creation in general. Like, what are your thoughts on, like, are Adam and Eve actually real people, or do you think that they're not? Like, was the flood a real thing? Was it not? Like, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. You wanna go first?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a great question, and it's one that I, like, wrestled with for a while, because I do think sometimes in our religious upbringing, it's made to be a really big deal. Like, is it literal or not? And I guess I've come to a place that, like, it doesn't matter to me that much. And I don't mean that in the sense that I don't care, but, like, has anyone read The Life of Pi or seen that movie? So my favorite thing, like, I'm totally going to spoil it. I'm just going to say that right now. It's important though. But he tells this whole story, and then he tells a second story, and then they say, which story is true? And he said, like, in both stories, you get the information you need. And he was like, but which is the better story? And then they say the one with the tiger, and he says, so it goes with God. And so to me, I guess like, I'm not trying to skirt your question, but I'm trying to say like, it's kind of become less important because I think whether it's true or not, what do I learn about the character of God in those stories? And that's me getting the information I need without needing to know if it's literal or not.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful thing. So I take the question at its core to be like inerrancy of Scripture question, right? Like, what do we believe to be true about the Bible? And I don't know if you jacked this quote from someone else, but I thought it was wonderful. But Emily and I were talking one time, and she quoted someone saying, like, would you ever ask if like a symphony is inerrant? And they'd be like, no, it's beautiful, right? Like it's moving me, it touches me. And so for me, the overarching 30,000 foot answer is like when I read the creation story, like I hear a story about a God that cared so much that God created creation, right? And that there was a relationship there. And also there are some things that God's creation did that kind of pushed away from that. And like it begins a story of love, relationship, and eventual pursuit of God's creation. So and then like the flood and those things, like I personally, from my take, and I'm like always been really gray. This is one of the areas that we don't always like. Emily's really black and white, and or was at one point really black and white. I've always really embraced the gray. And so for me, I've never needed any of those stories to be true. What I think is an interesting question to ask is like, why, if that story is literal, why does it cause tension in me, or why do I find it to be valuable? And if it's not literal, why do I enjoy it, or why does it cause tension? Because I think that at the core, I find to be the more interesting question. Like why do I need Adam and Eve to be real? Or why do I want it to be a poem? Like, why do I believe in a 7-day creation? Or why do I believe that it was a larger system than that, right? And so I think for me, I've always tried to ask myself those questions. I'm not hiding anything from anyone. I don't believe the creation story to be literal. So I don't need you guys to side with me or not side with me on that. I don't need it to be literal. I don't necessarily believe it to be literal. But I also know that if I look into the Hebrew text, it's generally written in a pretty poetic way. And so it falls much closer into poetic literature than it does into historical literature. And so when I look at that, I'm like, that's interesting. But it also doesn't change how I read the story and why I see it to be valuable. I'll say my wife, who I love dearly, she needs it to be literal. And so like when we wrestle, our relationship is really interesting because we come at stories very differently. She was Emily's high school teacher at this Presbyterian school. And so like my wife is like deeply Presbyterian, which comes with a lot of different things. Inerrancy of Scripture at a high value is a big deal in that. And so like for us though, it's like what I have found really interesting is we found, and this is not answering your question exactly, but it's an offshoot of it. Like we found so much more joy. I remember my wife and I went on a walk and we're like, what if we just talked about like everything rooted in the core of who Jesus is and why he matters and always point back to that? Because that we can agree on. And so like my wife and I found a lot of joy. Like, and we also, my wife I'm an 8 on the Enneagram. If you know the Enneagram, she is not that. And so like I dig on some conflict and she's like, please never again. And so like we engage those conversations differently. So I don't know if that answered your question, but hopefully it was helpful.
Can I say one more thing? I'm
Probably
sorry to
not,
like keep going on this question, but I like wrestled with that exact question for a really long time. And I remember I asked this lady who I knew who was like a devout Christian and also a biology professor. And so I was like, oh my God, like, what do you think about evolution? Like, are you a young earth creationist? Are you an old earth creationist? Like all that. And she said, she goes, Emily, that Genesis was written by Moses when the Israelites were like in the desert waiting, and they needed to know what was true about God. They did not care. Like, is evolution real? Did God create the world in 7 days? Like, they needed a reminder of who God was. And when I think about the original purpose, it also helps me maybe like point to, like, what is the point of Genesis? And it isn't a science textbook. Like it is. That's not the point. Is who God is. That's the last thing I'd say.
I'm curious as you and your wife.
as you guys raise kids and are so maybe different in some of this interpretation, how does that play out? Is that fair to ask?
It's so fair to ask. The question will get even more nuanced than you thought it was going to be. So I'm also divorced, and my ex-wife is deeply irreligious, and so I have my irreligious ex-wife, who my kids are with 2 of my kids are with 50% of the time. My wife, who is not a fundamental, but she's like more conservative in some of her beliefs, and then myself, who's just like a hippy dippy progressive, right? So, which is not I don't think that's really true about me. But that's a good question. So I don't force my kids to go to church, right? But we always talk about like our beliefs on the core, and we let our kids, and I mean, like my kids are 9, 7, and 2, and so they're not diving into a lot of like stuff on eschatology and that kind of stuff. But we try to provide them with enough resources to be like, this is why we believe what we believe. This is where we disagree. And this is where I think it connects to this deconstruction conversation, is like, I think if I'm hyper prescriptive and I tell them I know everything, like I don't know everything. Like I've been wrong about more things than I've been right about, both in life, faith, marriage, and parenting and everything, right? And so I think, again, we have some family values of like curiosity. We have some family values of humility and respect. And so like we'll always openly share the things we believe. I want my kids deeply to fall in love with Jesus the same way I did. I think a relationship of true love can't be forced, both in anything. Emily and I had a debate about this really today. I can't force them. So I don't know like if that answers that super well, but like we want to create an ecosystem of that, but we also like try to surround them with friends that show them what the love of Christ looks like. Every Christian I grew up with was a hypocritical, like mean, judgmental person. And so I like had to deconstruct a lot of those things because everything I knew to be true about every good Christian leader. I had my biggest mentor like 5 years ago, just his life imploded because we found out it was like a web of manipulation and lies, right? And so I'd rather lead with so much more openness and authenticity and honesty so that I don't have to do the work later when my kids find out that I kind of suck in some ways, right? And they're like, I don't have everything right. And so I try to be as open and honest as I can. So.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Hi. So
Hi.
I'm thinking about like what starts somebody on a deconstruction journey? Like what sort of initiates that? What's the catalyst? I'm also a young Methodist pastor, and so those that I have sort of seen maybe begin this journey, a lot of times it seems to be triggered by grief or like a traumatic event that they either experience personally or that happens in the community, and they realize like, shit, all these things I believed about God, like something has shifted in me, and this doesn't feel right anymore. So I guess my question is like, what role have you seen grief play in the deconstruction journey?
So I think you'll have a longer answer, so I'll go first.
Okay.
So I would say it's 100% tied to it. Like when I started The Well, like 15 months ago, we started this podcast 40 weeks ago, the number of pastors that I've had reach out to me that have had a catalytic moment of grief that have never been able to talk about it, but have deconstructed behind closed doors is innumerable. It's like so many people, and it blows my mind, not because they're doing it, because they don't feel like they have anyone to talk to. Emily is a rare breed in that she's like, I'm not just going to process this on my own, but I'm going to process it with hundreds of listeners every week, which I think is really fun. But like a lot of people's stories start in grief as a catalyst to it becoming public from my perspective. But I think the chips were always crumbling behind closed doors, and that's been a common thread I've seen is like the lack of belief or the questions were there, but the moment, like a leader failing or a divorce or a breakup or a loved one dying, gave them permission at a level they never saw to ask more questions they didn't think they were allowed to ask. So from my perspective, grief is the ultimate catalyst, or like hard times are the ultimate catalyst. I think but that's, I think, a symptom to the disease that is our church cultures haven't created places for people to process the pain and the questions they have well before a traumatic life event happens.
I freaking love that. Not trying to like
Thanks.
pat your ego, but yeah, I want to say first, and I totally like don't think you were saying this, but I do think it's important to name is like something starting in grief or something starting in a traumatic event doesn't make it any less valid. Like I think that my friend said that a while back, and it stuck with me because sometimes people will be like, well, you just did this like because you got hurt. And I'm just like, okay, like maybe that's true. That doesn't mean the journey isn't real or is not a real reason. And so I do think that that's important to say. But I would agree with you. Like, I think grief's an interesting word that I definitely, we have a podcast episode that we talked about the 5 stages of grief, like in deconstruction. Shameless plug, I guess. But like, I definitely think it's catalyzed with hard times. And I love what you said that there's things already crumbling that hard times like show. But I think for me personally, there were multiple things that were catalysts. Some of them were like definitely hurt from the church and from pastors, like a moral failing from a pastor, like that was part of it. But also part of it, and this is not everyone's experience, but like I dated someone in a different denomination, which sounds like not a big deal, but it was a huge deal as like the super Presbyterian that I was. Sorry. And I like realized, it was a moment for me where I realized someone could take the Bible another way and still be really trying to pursue truth. And that was like, that blew my mind. And so I would say like, for me personally, there were several catalysts at the same time, but grief and hard times is definitely a part of it. And I'm not sure I would say grief started my journey, but grief has absolutely been deeply tied to my journey because as you pull Jenga blocks out, like it's different in Jenga and that those blocks meant a lot to you. And when you pull it out, it's like sad. And so like grief has been deeply tied to my journey. I'm not 100% sure I would say like grief was the main catalyst, but yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Yeah, I'm going to go, this is like real pastor of me, like might make this into a sermon sometime. But I think like the proclamation of the gospel began with grief too. Like Mary like was in huge grief before she went and shared the gospel with other people, right? Like there was all the disciples, like there was so much sadness and grief. And they also in deconstructing what they assumed to be true about Jesus, that he was going to be a triumphant militaristic leader, to embrace a much more subversive gospel. And so I think like and this is why like this podcast isn't to convert or win Emily over, but the reason I love deconstruction is because I think the process leads us to see the truest version of the gospel as we strip away all the trappings of what we have been told the church has to be. And again, like I'm its biggest proponent and proprietor, right? I pastor a church, but I think grief is what began like some of the biggest transformations of like the heroes of the faith, that I think is really interesting. So I also want to be like cognizant of our time. I don't like want to keep you guys here forever, but I will take, what's that? Yeah, 15 more questions, he said? No. So like anyone, like we'll take any more before we kind of wrap up. Does anyone have any like anything else like pointed or general or anything like that? Yeah.
Hi. I was kind of interested in your college experience because I know you said like you go hyper-religion to party, and I was just like, I think that causes a big divide like on campus. And I was just wondering like, can you be a middle? Because like I know sometimes people feel judged if they do go out and then go to church the next morning. Like, what would you say about kind of the middle ground?
Phenomenal question. I'm going to start with a little bit of a story. I can't believe I'm telling this story, but we're here. So I was on leadership with my campus ministry, classic, and my friend and I on leadership were like, we want to get super drunk. We've never gotten super drunk, and so we hung out with some other like campus ministry leaders, and apparently they thought we were joking, but we were not joking. So we got sloshed. I mean, I'm just gonna be real. It was my first time getting like super drunk, and it was like I felt like it was a safe environment, safe people. like, it was like partying, I guess, but it was like with religious people that I trusted, because my campus ministry was definitely, well, my denomination was pretty chill about alcohol. Anyway, so I made a lot of people super mad that night because they thought I was joking. And I was like, I said I was going to get sloshed. Like, I was up front. You guys didn't believe me. That's kind of on you. Whatever. But then like, our campus pastor was like so mad. He was like, I can't believe that you would do that. Like, that's not leadership. Like, that's not being a good leader, and like all that. And I don't know, whatever your thoughts are on that. But I would say, like, I tried to do the middle ground, and this is just my story particularly. Like, I tried to be like, with my religious bros also drinking, and then it just blew up. Like, it was so dramatic, and it didn't need to be. Like, they're like, I was just so hurt that you got drunk. And I was like, I wasn't like pouring it down your throat. Like, I got drunk. Like, anyway, I probably still need to process through this. It was really frustrating. And then the new pastor came in and just like banned alcohol from leadership. After that, it was intense. So and not that it's all about alcohol, but I would say like, I tried the middle ground, and I want that to be a thing, and I hope that can be a thing, because absolutely, like, even if you party to a point where you feel guilty or feel like, oh, I like feel convicted and feel like I shouldn't have done this, like, that absolutely should never, ever negate like your ability to be in church. Like, that is a place where you are there to process and ponder and just like be with God. And like nothing that you do ever withholds God's presence from you. And so that should never be a bar. But I also get that sometimes it feels that way. And so I guess my answer is, I think that there is a middle ground, or I really think that there should be, but it is difficult. And if you don't hit the balance quite right, part of you is just like, well, let me just go to like the other side, because then at least no one's mad at me, you know? So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, super good answer. So I would say, did they name it the Emily Zell rule after you couldn't drink? Like, just
I wasn't the only one that got drunk that
I'm
night.
just kidding.
Okay.
So what I would say is an interesting, the Christian university, and whether it's a Christian university or not, but the college Christian bubble is the only place that's a real question. And I'll be kind of honest with you. And this comes from the guy that pastors a church that meets in a brewery, and my congregation all shares beers and pizza afterwards. And so it's not like people are doing Emily Zell keg stands after church, but like it's fun. And so I think like there's no other place in life where people are like, well, can you, because you're not necessarily saying, can you drink or whatever, but like my small group at church, we know how to get down. Like, we have fun. And it's like, no, but I don't have anyone else in my life. Like, my neighbors are like, Danny, did you think about like your witness? They're like, oh, you're just a normal human. And I think there is something to be said about like moderation is smart, like making wise decisions. I do think like considering like, this is one of my least favorite parts about being a pastor is I'm on all the time. Right. And so I know that like there are people that view me, and like if I'm doing something, I'm like, well, Danny's like, really let it go. Right. Like, so I think there's some things in that regard that take wisdom, but I think like understanding that it's probably more about the person that's casting the judgment than it is about you. And I think if you're thinking like, are the decisions I'm making ones that are out of wisdom, it's far different. I would say Emily is a great cautionary tale of what not to do. No, I'm just kidding.
I was like, what the heck?
You know me well.
Can I say, like, we've done shots together.
You can say that.
Like,
you did say that.
But like, I have never felt more pastored in that moment. Pickle shots at Crow's Nest. Do you remember that? That was the best. You came to my comedy show, and then we did shots after. But like, I'm sorry, but I say that, I actually say that so seriously, because Paul says, like, I quoted this earlier today, like, Paul says, I've become all things to all people that I might win more of them. Like, and Jesus does that all the time, as he enters into spaces that some people would say are not cool and you shouldn't enter in, and that means you're a bad person, in order to like be with people who need community and care. And I'm not saying that you were like, Emily needs some care, so I'm going to do a shot with her. But I felt so pastored in that moment because you entered into my space and just joined me. And you didn't sit there like a nerd and was like, you guys suck for drinking. Like, I'm sorry. Like, but that meant a lot to me. And so I'm not saying you have to drink to be a Christian. Like, that's also not what I'm saying. But I am saying that, like, I do think that there's a point in which doing things that feel more like the world is sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do.
Yeah, last thing I'll say on this, I'll say, Tim, after this podcast goes live and I lose my job, if you guys are hiring, that'd be great. So no, I think there's like, that's kind of what I was saying about my small group too. Like, I think being with people in real life is important. And I think like figuring out like how, like, and I don't know if this was the root of your question, but like, how are we like walking with people? That night, it was with pickle shots. But in other times, it was a great night. So last question. I didn't see it going that direction. So, but I'm not a stand-up comedian. So final question.
They're like, after that, we're done. Congrats.
All right. Well, before we wrap up, so I just want to say, this was like a lot of fun. Like for us, like I hope you guys enjoyed this in some degree, if not all of it. I know that between Dustin, Emily, and I, like our biggest joy in doing this is just like widening the conversation. And as I think as embarrassed as we can get about things we say, or like part of this is like we want to put out a level of being like we're trying to strip away a lot of like the false facade. And so then I said earlier, like my Christian upbringing was all hypocritical. Like I might have really enjoyed like having like more candid conversation of getting, and I'm not any of your guys' pastor. So you guys, like, I'm just another person that you might not ever talk to again. But I will say like people in my life, I would have really enjoyed like being like, hey, like they're actually a real person. Right. And I think for us in our faith, like that's one of the things that we want to project. And I think my encouragement to all of you, like whether you're deconstructing, whether you're like rock solid, or whether you've like never engaged faith, I think like authenticity and vulnerability and honesty, curiosity and humility, all of those things are like important pillars to like being a holistic person and kind of building something that will last in like whatever phase of life that is.
Yeah. And I also just want to like, I fully agree with everything you said. Like, yeah, we can get embarrassed, but we're also I think we're trying to like lead with vulnerability as best we can. But I do want to say also, like, the conversation doesn't have to end here. Like, I mean,
we're doing pickle shots after.
But Tim's like, please no. But I will say, just like, I'm not trying to do like a plug or whatever, but like, you can totally follow us on social media and ask questions on the pod, and like, we're happy to continue to answer if you're like, oh, I wish I would have asked them that. Like, people DM me sometimes. I'm always happy to have conversations, just because for so long, I felt so alone in my deconstruction. And so like, it is so important to me, even though it is vulnerable to be public on my deconstruction, the amount of people that have told me that they felt less alone is worth all of the like hate that I've gotten. And I also just want to end by saying like, embrace the journey.
Embrace the journey. Yeah. Thanks, guys. So I will say, as we built this like community, like it's much more than like a vanity project of doing a podcast together. But we like there is a community of people that we've been a part of, and like we've built relationships with people at all these events, and we really find value in it not ending in like a 1 hour thing.
Yeah.
So please, like whether it's with Emily, myself, or just like all of our stuff, like we would love to know what's going on in your journey. A lot of people send in like voice messages to the podcast too, that like we love because we hear where people are and we kind of try to like engage them in what we're doing. So just keep us posted. Like this is fun for us and want to keep knowing what's going on. So yeah. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, if you have not connected with the